If I were Chris Matthews back in his MSNBC heyday, I'd start this episode out by saying, "Spoilers! Let's play hardball!" Just to translate that for anybody who isn't quite nerdy enough to have gotten that reference, well, today we're going to be talking about the role that minor party candidates play in US presidential elections, and the threat that they pose this year to those of us hoping to save the United States from another 4 years of Donald Trump. Given that it was also Star Wars Day just a few days back, and this is officially the 66th episode of OK Talks, and I also just referenced a threat to end the Republic, I'm inclined to also make an Order 66 joke, but I've probably messed around already too much for one pre-intro segment, so... Hey everybody, welcome to OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with an academic background in international relations focused in security policy, and real-world experience working in the US domestic political space and living in a number of other countries than my own, all of which combined, I think, positions me fairly well both to interpret for my international audience what's going on in the politics of my own country, and to shed light for some of the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So, a couple weeks back, the Biden campaign released an ad featuring like 10 people with the rather famous last name Kennedy, talking about why he, that is to say Biden, is not only an excellent president, but also in many ways, realistically, the true inheritor of the legacy of other famous Kennedy leaders like John and Robert F. Kennedy. Of course, the reason this ad was clipped together and for the broader show of force by most of the Kennedy clan was not lost on anybody, and leads me to the topic of today's episode, which is the threat posed in this election cycle by minor party or so-called third-party candidates that operate often as spoilers at the presidential level. So, given that the usual audience of my podcast is made up both of fellow American nerds about US politics and also by a decent chunk of non-Americans who maybe are interested in US politics, but perhaps not quite plugged in enough that they would immediately know what I'm talking about if I say words like nadir or no labels, I think I'm going to go at this topic from a couple of different levels. So, for the sake of those who are less familiar with how minor party candidacies factor into the US political system, I'm going to first give a quick-ish, at least I promise I'll try, overview of how that works, and then get into some concrete examples of how minor party candidates have affected things in the past and then what we're dealing with this year. So, among liberal democracies, the US has an almost uniquely stupid way of selecting its head of government. I know you all think that I mean the Electoral College, and yes, that is part of it, and I will be talking about that here, but that is not all. Even if the US got rid of the Electoral College tomorrow, which, to be clear, anybody that doesn't come from like 10 states with massively outsized influence at the presidential level should absolutely want, as I would argue should everybody else in America who wants to live in a representative democracy, we still would have a worse way of picking our head of government than would most other democracies that exist today. I'm still trying to decide like what order to present all these things. Okay, I think I'll go with just sort of a quick overview of the Electoral College for anybody who isn't familiar with how it works, and then I will come back to the first past the post problem that I was starting to hint at there. Both of those things relate to both why the U.S. has such a stubborn two-party situation, and to why minor party candidates tend to realistically increase the risk of Americans electing a bad candidate that the majority do not actually want. So, first, just quickly on the Electoral College, for any who don't already know how this ridiculous system works. So, originally very afraid of mob rule, the framers built this sort of check, it was intended to be, into the system in order to prevent a foreign influence demagogue from ever getting to the White House. Now, of course, ironically enough, in 2016, that supposed check ended up having the exact opposite of its intended effect, but okay. Presidents of the US are chosen by the Electoral College, which is a body made up of delegates representing each state roughly but not exactly based on population. So in theory, at least I think, states actually have some leeway in terms of what delegates they send to the Electoral College after an election. This opened the door, by the way, to at least one of the ways in which Trump tried to rat fuck the results of the 2020 election, but yeah, well, you save that one for another day. In practice, all of the states, with two exceptions that aren't super important to this basic explanation, give all of their electoral votes, or that is to say, assign the delegates after an election to the Electoral College based on whichever candidate is first past the post. That is to say, has won a plurality, the most votes in that particular state. This is how it's possible for a candidate to win millions more votes overall, but still lose the presidency in the Electoral College. This is what happened to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So let's say you have two states. State 1 has a population of about 3 million and 35 electoral votes. State 2 has a population of about 2 million and 25 electoral votes. Now let's say that candidate A wins state 1 with just barely over 50% of the vote, while candidate B wins state 2 with almost 100% of the vote. So in this scenario, candidate A would have won just like a little over 1.5 million votes, while candidate B would have won like a little bit under 3.5 million votes. So candidate B has almost 2 million more votes overall, but at the end of the day, candidate A has won more electoral votes because they won in the larger state, and thus candidate A becomes the president. The Electoral College, of course, also has the effect of making the voters of most American states pretty close to irrelevant at the presidential level, since the only states that matter are the few where it's likely to be close. This year, that is to say, the presidential election realistically will be decided in Michigan, go blue, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Also important will be Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and let's say if Biden's having a very good night, North Carolina, potentially Florida, and if Trump's having a really good night, potentially New Hampshire, and maybe Minnesota. Now, if you vote somewhere else, for the record, I don't in any way mean to discourage you from voting. You absolutely should vote. There will almost certainly be other extremely important races happening where you'll be voting, either for Senate or House races and gubernatorial elections. A lot of states this year have ballot initiatives wherein the voters of those states will decide realistically whether or not the governments of those states should force women to carry unwanted pregnancies to term. Also, there will be local elections, like at the municipal city level, that could have an impact in the short or the long term. But at the presidential level, sorry, if you're not from one of those states I mentioned earlier, this year at least, realistically, you're just not going to matter that much. So, in addition to the just like straight up weirdness of the Electoral College, I referred to the first past the post thing earlier. Here's what I mean by that. So the US at the presidential level really does not offer any mechanism to express or to demonstrate voters' like order of preference in terms of their options, and as a result denies voters the ability to at all like officially demonstrate support for a party or candidate that might not be already guaranteed to be one of the top two finishers. It really is kind of a silly, unsophisticated way of picking a head of government when compared to other liberal democracies, almost all of which have figured out a better way of doing this. So let me share with you an analogy that I often use, to explain to folks from other countries how the U.S. presidential system works, in order to sort of compare different ways of electing a head of government. So let's say that there are 10 people who are going out to an absolutely mandatory dinner that no, you cannot get out of. And they're trying to decide what they want to eat. 2 want burgers, 1 wants Italian, 3 want Mexican, and 4 want dog food. So under the US system, those people all vote, and, well, I think you remember which one had the most votes. And that's it. The end. Enjoy your puppy chow. Another way of doing this would be to hold a first vote, which includes every option under consideration, after which then the top 2 vote getters would advance to a second round, and then they would vote again, with the winner of that second round being the one chosen. So under this system, Mexican and dog food win the first round, and then presumably the remaining, human food eaters now also vote for Mexican food in the second round, and Mexican food wins. This is called a runoff. It's how they do it in France, a number of Latin American countries, not to mention actually in the Senate races in a couple of different US states. Another way of choosing a head of government would be to have everybody vote for the representatives elected by that vote. Again, the results were 2 for burgers, 1 for Italian, 3 for Mexican, and 4 for dog food. Come to some sort of consensus that's backed by the majority. So maybe the human food eaters will end up coalescing behind Italian in the end, because although it wasn't the most popular choice, the burger people are really just afraid of spicy food, so they don't want Mexican, and ultimately all 6 of them really don't want to eat dog food. This is my sad approximation of a parliamentary system. It's how a number of European countries, Israel, some others do it to choose their head of government. But as you can see, In the US system, per my delicious analogy, the people who don't want to eat dog food are given no electoral mechanism whatsoever to express a degree of difference without risking a default to the absolute worst option on the table. This incentivizes them to basically preemptively consolidate into two giant blocks. And that's where the US's two-party system comes from. So that's the theory, that's the structure that we're dealing with in the US. I'm not endorsing it, I'm not celebrating the fact that that's the way it is, but that's the way it is. Now, in practice, of course, the two-party system does not mean that there are, in fact, only two parties ever on the ballot. There are, as we know, other minor parties, and although virtually never viable, at least not at the presidential level, some people sometimes decide for a variety of reasons that they are going to go ahead and vote for something outside one of the two major parties. Some minor party voters maybe genuinely are somewhere between the Republicans and the Democrats on the issues and straight up can't decide. Some lean toward one of the two big parties, but maybe are mad at them and want to make a protest vote at the moment, or they want to elevate a specific issue profile or a minor party that they like. And, if you live in a state where the outcome is already totally predetermined, as I laid out a few minutes back when explaining the Electoral College, well, in that case, this can be harmless. But if you're in a swing state, well, it does not usually work out very well, as I'll get to in a minute. Some who vote for minor parties are the sorts of people who like to think of themselves as informed, but have still somehow managed to avoid learning even the most basic facts about the differences between the two major parties' issue profiles and basic conduct, and instead labor under a delusion that usually sounds something along the lines of, whatever man, the two parties are exactly the same anyway. Others, I think, will sometimes vote for a third party because they, genuinely just don't know enough about the US political system to understand that voting for a minor party at the presidential level is a wasted vote that has the practical effect, usually, of, by default, boosting your least desired candidate. Those are the people, ultimately, that I feel the most sympathy for. Because the US electoral system is, in a lot of ways, complicated and, frankly, does not make a ton of sense, per the analogy I used earlier. And also, people are busy. Most people just aren't anywhere near as interested in politics as I am, or as are, I would assume, the vast majority of people who would, voluntarily listen to a show like this. And, well, at the end of the day, it's not those people's fault that we basically just quit teaching civics in the schools. All right, with me having now spent at least a couple of minutes on that, admittedly at least a little bit disingenuous analysis of the reasons somebody might vote for third-party candidates at the presidential level, let's take a look at what the consequences of doing this have been in the recent past. So, for the sake of doing that, let's just go directly at the most important headline here, which is that the last two Republicans to occupy the Oval Office would not have been elected president without the help of minor party candidates in the elections of 2000 and 2016. Now, I should say, I'm using the word help very much intentionally. First of all, because former Republican operatives like the Lincoln Project's Rick Wilson have come straight out and said that Republican strategists will often go ahead and try to get third-party candidates into races in order to mess with the Democrats. Also, lunatic perennial Green Party candidate Dr. Jill Stein, who has had some very uncomfortably cozy relationships in the past with the Russians, was actively backed by them in 2016 in order to help Donald Trump, reports now show. And then this year, one of the high-profile minor party attempts that I'll talk about in a few minutes was supported primarily by Trump donors. So yeah, I used the word help on purpose. So I mentioned 2000 and 2016, and I'm going to take a look at those two examples in a minute. But before I do, I want to just remind folks here, if you haven't already, to be sure to subscribe to the show or follow the channel, whatever it's called, on whichever platform you ordinarily listen to OK Talks. Also, please do be sure to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it, and share this episode specifically with anybody who's confused about the risk from third-party candidates in 2024. I should say, this episode is one that I'm doing specifically because multiple listeners to OK Talks have reached out and told me that they would like to hear me weighing in on minor party candidates as it pertains to this election. That being said, if folks listening have other topics that you think I should be covering, ideas for the show, guests you think that I should have on, please really do feel free to reach out to me at oktalkspodcast@gmail.com. So to get back to what we were talking about, there's a lot that could be said about the election of 2000. But in brief, Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, looked as though he had won on election night. At the very least, he had won the popular vote, and at that point, I believe nobody had been elected president without having also won the popular vote in like more than a century. In the Electoral College, it all came down to Florida. Now, I could go into a whole bunch of detail about dimple ballots and hanging chads and the various issues that arose with the practicalities of counting the vote and the fact that Bush's brother was the governor, and then the fact that the right-wing Supreme Court nationally basically stepped in to stop the recount at exactly the moment when it favored George Bush. But I'm going to suggest that people interested in those details instead go and watch the HBO movie Recount, and rather here just mention that at the end of the day, Al Gore lost Florida by something like 500 votes out of a total of almost 6 million. But 97,000 of those 6 million votes did go to Ralph Nader, the candidate from the Green Party. And sure, potentially if Nader hadn't been on the ballot, some of those 97,000 voters would have just stayed home. And who knows, maybe a few of the people that showed up to vote for the Green Party, a party that in the US usually represents the strange, fringe end of the left side of the spectrum, would have, for some reason, voted for George Bush instead of Gore. Maybe they would have, accidentally pushed the button next to Bush's name instead of Gore's. But no one in their right mind thinks that at least the plurality of the people who voted for Ralph Nader in Florida wouldn't have voted for Al Gore had Ralph Nader not been on the ballot. Certainly enough to make up for a 500 vote deficit out of a total vote count of 6 million. No Nader candidacy, no George Bush presidency. No George Bush presidency, no Iraq war, no stupid deficit-exploding tax cuts for the rich, no Supreme Court John Roberts and Samuel fucking Alito, possibly no global economic disaster in 2008. To quote Bush himself, and I've been waiting for ages for the chance to take a break from Trump and instead test out this impression, our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people. And neither do we. Look, Ralph Nader got a little under 3% of the vote nationally. There was zero chance that he was ever going to be elected president. But he did manage to effectively give the job to George Bush. Because those little numbers around the margin, in a system as weird as the US one, unfortunately, those little numbers around the margin often have a dramatic impact. In 2020, for example, Joe Biden won nationally by 7 million votes. But if something like 40,000 votes across 3 states had gone the wrong way, well, I'd be recording this from an undisclosed location for fear that President Donald Trump would use his total immunity. Okay, I have the most immunity in the history of immunities. To send a SEAL team to blow my head off for the time I described his hair as the product of a failed scalp reduction surgery carried out by a mad scientist in the 80s. Speaking of Trump being the president, let's have a look at 2016. And very different from 2000 in certain ways, but in others, kind of eerily similar. Not a super high turnout, coming on the heels of a pretty successful Democratic presidency. A lot of people kind of lulled into a false sense of security, and partially as a result of that, I would argue, we had a couple of minor party candidates running similar, no chance in hell, but fuck it, let's tilt at windmills anyway, presidential campaigns. Only in 16, instead of Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan, this time it was Dr. Jill Stein and Gary, what is Aleppo, Johnson. And what happened? Well, there's a ton that I could say about sexism and bad behavior during the primary and an active information warfare campaign carried out by the spy agencies of America's main geostrategic antagonist, stupid decisions made by almost everyone from the press to the FBI director grounded in the faulty notion that Hillary couldn't possibly lose because, come on, she was running against a barely literate reality show clown with strange cotton candy hair that's the product of a failed scalp reduction surgery carried out by a mad scientist in the 80s. There's a lot that I could say about all that, but instead, I'm going to focus on the topic at hand. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote of the American people in 2016 overall by substantially more than Al Gore did in 2000. She lost the Electoral College because of 3 states going the wrong way: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and, for shame, my home state of Michigan. In Michigan and Wisconsin, the total number of votes won just by Jill Stein were greater than Trump's margin of victory. And again, it's really very hard to imagine that a lot of people who were inclined to vote for the Green Party wouldn't end up voting for the Democratic candidate when faced with a realistic choice. In Pennsylvania, the combination of Stein's and Johnson's votes were vastly more than Trump's margin of victory. And I think at the end of the day, probably at least some of the libertarians who voted for Gary Johnson would have gone to Hillary, and virtually none of the Stein votes, again, would have gone to Trump. So, bottom line, I would say, yeah, no Stein and Johnson futile vanity candidacies, no Trump presidency. No Trump presidency, no. Well, if I were to actually go down that rabbit hole like I did with Bush before, you and I would both need several bathroom and food breaks and a stiff drink, or 10, before I got through. So, as crazy as 2020 was, we did, possibly as a result of just how dire everything was at the time, seem to have a temporary moment of sanity in which most of the fringe narcissists and cranks that usually mount third-party presidential bids decided to hang up their anti-vaccine treatises and boot-shaped hats, true story, Google Vermin Supreme, and sit that one out. No such luck this year. This year, a whole bunch of the same people that brought us Donald Trump in 2016 are back with a vengeance, and they're joined by several additional wackos, like the one that I hinted at back at the beginning. So I'm going to take the rest of this episode to have a look at a couple of those real and potential minor party candidacies, and then probably to sort of preemptively push back on some of the potential pushback grounded in the idea that I'm only saying all of this because I'm, a partisan Democrat and fundamentally have a problem with other parties. I think I'll start with the minor party challenge that initially looked like it was going to be the biggest threat, which was a potential candidacy sponsored by the group No Labels. Now, No Labels has existed for a little over a decade, billing itself as sort of a centrist organization trying to reduce nihilistic partisanship, promote bipartisan cooperation and compromise, and bring down the temperature and focus on our commonalities instead of our differences and all that sort of stuff, which I am totally here for the record. And that may have once been what No Labels was doing. My understanding, for example, is that No Labels may have in some way been behind the creation of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers caucus in the House, which is great. I should say, I've not been like a super close follower of the organization over the years, but that is sort of my understanding. My understanding is also, though, that the organization really seems to have shifted the last year or two, whether out of genuine bad intentions or because it was being manipulated to another purpose, that being to get into the windmill-tilting third-party presidential candidate business. Now, the way they wanted to do this was to recruit one of the remaining few high-profile, relative moderates from American politics, a Mitt Romney, a Joe Manchin, maybe Chris Christie, someone like that, to run for president outside of the two major parties. No Labels made active efforts to get a potential candidate on the ballots of important states, and did actually manage to get onto a decent number. But although a few of those potential candidates publicly flirted with the idea of running out of what I can only imagine was enjoyment of the inevitable attention, in the end, all of them ultimately turned down the idea, because they understood what No Labels either didn't or claimed to not understand, which is that running like this would almost inevitably have served as a huge spoiler to the benefit of Donald Trump to help him waddle back into the Oval Office. I should note that the Trump camp seems to agree, since at least one of No Labels' largest donors is also one of Trump's largest donors. And although none of the people who might have run under the auspices of No Labels agree with Joe Biden on every single point of policy, they all seem to understand that he is a fundamentally decent guy and a good leader, or at least that he's not a narcissistic authoritarian menace to society carrying out a revenge fantasy with a strange cotton candy hair thingy that's the product of a failed scalp reduction surgery carried out in the 80s by a mad scientist. And thus, with none of the stars that they hope to recruit ultimately being interested, died the No Labels third-party bid of 2024. Next on the menu is, again, Jill Stein of the Green Party. Now, just a quick note of clarification here. Although there are Green parties in a number of countries, many of which are solid, mainstream political parties that run serious candidates with actual policy agendas that look more like pragmatic solutions to real problems and less like levitating the Pentagon, the American Green Party is not one of them. I think that Green parties in a number of other places would frankly rather that the American one had a different name. Jill Stein, as you've already heard, acted as a spoiler in the 2016 election, before which she said a bunch of dumb shit and attempted to sabotage the Democratic National Convention that year. Apparently helping Donald Trump into the Oval Office one time was not enough for Stein, who is back for more this year. As of right now, she is on the ballot in a number of states, including, I believe, the important swing states of Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida, and the critical swing states of Michigan and Wisconsin, with hopes to make it onto more. And then there's Dr. Cornel West. West, of course, is a philosopher, scholar, and activist who's made hugely important contributions as an academic, but has for a number of years now been pretty loudly espousing the brand of ivory tower leftism that, well, let's say, does rather a lot more to help inflate the sense of awesome moral superiority among those who espouse it than it does to help actually achieve a single liberal or progressive priority, or really make any concrete progress at all toward improving the lives of real people. To wit, here's Cornel West's take on Barack Obama, a fairly successful liberal or progressive president by most reasonable standards. Obama was, in Cornel West's words, quote, a black mascot of Wall Street oligarchs and a black muppet of corporate plutocrats, and now he has become the head of the American killing machine and is proud of it, unquote. Also, quote, a Rockefeller Republican in blackface, unquote. As far as I understand it, Cornel West is not on the ballot in quite as many places as is the Green Party, but everywhere that he is on the ballot, he would almost certainly have a similar spoiler effect. Massive Trump donor and Clarence Thomas's corporate sponsor Harlan Crow seems to think so, since he made a huge donation to Cornel West's presidential campaign. Now, in fairness to West, he did give it back. He did return the money, but I mean, if Harlan Crow is attempting to support what you're doing, maybe ask yourself why. And then maybe also stop whatever it is that you're doing. And then there's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the guy whose family basically all just came out to say, yeah, please vote for President Biden and not our crazy relative. And the fact that basically the whole Kennedy clan has come out to say, yeah, sorry, Bobby's nuts, is important. Because polls show that most voters, definitely a lot of the ones who support RFK Jr., know almost nothing about him, which would seem to indicate that at least a decent bit of his support is probably grounded in the fact that his last name is Kennedy. So then, who is RFK Jr. really? Without wanting to spend a ton of time here basically just reciting his bio, RFK Jr. started out as an environmental lawyer who did good work at a couple of different environmental NGOs, and then a couple of decades back just veered wildly off into Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs anti-vaccine conspiracy theoryville. This is not a guy who just suddenly got kind of weird about vaccines around COVID, although he did speculate that the virus might have been genetically targeted to go after white and black people but spare Chinese people and the Jews. He later denied this, but come on, dude, it's on video. As I say, RFK Jr., he's like an OG vaccine denier. He's gone after the measles vaccine, even the polio vaccine. I mean, hey, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, measles is apparently making a comeback right now. Why not polio as well? And who doesn't love a good iron lung? But it goes beyond just the vaccine stuff. And this is a guy who genuinely appears to never have met a conspiracy theory that he didn't like. I mean, just to name a few, he's implied that the US, presumably the CIA, which also, by the way, definitely killed his uncle, so I guess that's Ted Cruz's dad off the hook. He's implied that the US somehow engineered the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2014. He's also pushed the debunked Ukraine bioweapons lab conspiracy theory. He's claimed that Wi-Fi and also cell phones break down the blood-brain barrier and give you brain cancer. He's, at least in the past, voiced skepticism that the HIV virus causes AIDS. He said that 5G towers are emitting radiation, and among other conspiracy theories, I believe, mass shootings in America might be caused by overuse of antidepressants. I think there are actually a decent number of people who do argue that maybe in the United States we are a little bit too quick these days to medicate everything. That is a valid conversation to have. But in a country where there are literally more guns than people, I don't think we need to look all that hard to find the culprit for all the mass shootings. Outside of the conspiracy theories, RFK Jr. seems to just lie, as a matter of course. There was something a couple months back where he was talking about some documentary that he'd worked on that didn't end up moving forward, where he'd in some way been working with Jake Tapper, now of CNN, and RFK Jr. claimed that Tapper had, reached out to him to tell him that the network had killed the story because corporate didn't like it, or something, and Tapper has since come out and said that not only did he never say anything like that to RFK Jr., but also nothing like it had happened. in this instance. I mean, various others have talked about RFK Jr.'s tendency to be comfortable not only buying into zany conspiracy theories, but to himself really just make things up out of whole cloth. And with all that being the case, it's kind of hard to tell what his candidacy is actually about, like what his genuine positions are. Because, for example, he has said a number of things that indicate that he's super anti choice and would almost certainly sign a national abortion ban if given the opportunity. But then he's turned around and denied all that and basically stopped talking about the issue of choice entirely. His whole shtick overall seems to be grounded in a sort of anti establishment, anti corporate je ne sais quoi, which makes it pretty ironic that for his vice presidential candidate, he selected Nicole Shanahan. And if your reaction to that name was, wait, who the fuck is that? Well, you're not alone. Turns out she's some super rich biotech person who used to be married to the co founder of Google. And in case that doesn't make it clear why I say that RFK Jr.'s pick of her is rather ironic, given that his whole platform seems to be like anti-establishment, anti-corruption, like anti-corporate vibes. Well, her only calling card really does appear to be that she's super rich and can help fund his efforts to get onto the ballot. Since she was announced as the candidate, by the way, basically no one has seen or heard from her. Or as the DNC's Liz Smith put it, she appears to have been put into the witness protection program. It really, at this point, remains to be seen whether RFK Jr. will do more damage to Biden or to Trump in the election. Some worry that the Kennedy name and disaffection with Biden because people aren't aware of his actual accomplishments, or because most of the media has basically just spent the last 2 years writing an article every 45 minutes to remind everyone that Biden was born during World War II, will mean that Kennedy, that is to say, will take more potential Biden voters than potential Trump voters. Others think that because Kennedy appears to be basically a conspiracy theorist grifter who may or may not support a national abortion ban and think that the COVID vaccine makes you sprout a third leg, that he might end up skimming off more potential Trump voters. Either way, Democrats everywhere should know as much as possible about this guy, because quite evidently, the more you learn, the worse it gets. This guy really is not any more of a serious person who should be given any sort of serious responsibility than is Donald Trump. And running the world is a serious business, and the American president is very much in that business, or at least is supposed to be. And like it or not, Americans, we have a responsibility to be more careful and serious in our vote for our head of government than the voters of any other country, not less. And I can just hear the system is rigged, man, the two-party system is totally corrupt, man, crowd taking issue with what I'm saying. And I want to just preemptively, push back on that. Firstly, I think my dog food analogy earlier in the episode made it pretty clear that I am not at all blind to the very serious flaws in the way that we choose our head of government in America and the resulting two-party system. Further, I'm at least a little bit jealous of other democratic systems of governance, like the one that exists in the country where I live at the moment, that I think ultimately do, in fact, do a substantially better job of representing the actual will of the voters in those countries. But we've got to be realistic about the rules of the game that we're playing, and then, rather than just wish we were playing a game with different rules, play to win under the rules that do in fact apply here. Sorry, there is just way too much at stake this year to fuck around. Which brings me to one point that the advocates of minor parties often make when it is suggested to them that they should, face reality and vote for a viable candidate rather than tilting at windmills with their minor party vote. Or as the alien Kang put it in that Simpsons episode where it's revealed that he and his sister Kodos had possessed the bodies of Bill Clinton and Bob Dole in advance of the 1996 election, go ahead, throw your vote away. Sorry, where was I? Right. Okay, so when told, hey, guys, come on, this election is way too important, you cannot just waste your vote, advocates of minor parties will often respond with something along the lines of, you guys, you always say that in every single election so we don't ever build power for our third party movement. And no, bullshit. There have been a number of elections over the last couple of decades where the stakes were for sure high, but not like this. I mean, 2012, maybe 2008 even, those would have been fine. I mean, the very system of democratic governance in America would not have ended if Mitt Romney had been elected president in 2012. But if Donald Trump manages to waddle his fat ass back into the Oval Office, it very well might, as he spelled out pretty fucking clearly in Time magazine last week. And before this hypothetical person I'm arguing with comes back at me with some form of, whatever, man, you just love the two-party system because you're a partisan Democrat who wants to keep third parties out of the system because it could erode your own party's power. No. No, I'm not in principle opposed to additional parties. I mean, for my own personal reasons, I would love to be in a system that would allow me to not necessarily be in the exact same party with, and thus at times have to tolerate or excuse bad behavior of a number of the people that I share the big tent of the Democratic Party with out of necessity, as the last several months have vividly reminded me. Also, ultimately, I think the United States would be dramatically healthier and less polarized, not just as a democracy, but as like a society more broadly, were we not so, at this point, perfectly bisected into two camps. And I would very much like for all that to change. But the US, our system anyway, it's not France. We do not have a system that enables a Macron-like figure to sweep into the top job and then basically build a viable party infrastructure behind them just in time for the next set of legislative elections a few months later. Without wanting to go too far down this rabbit hole, well, one way that you could build an actual viable third party in the United States would be to start locally. Specifically, my idea would be go into states where one party has a monopoly because the other party is completely toxic there and run for mayor, house, maybe even senate or governor at some point in those places. Mount a serious challenge to one party dominance in those areas by not wrapping yourself up in a brand that is anathema there. This actually sort of happened in 2022 in the Senate race in Utah. So rather than putting up a Democratic sacrificial lamb with zero chance whatsoever of winning statewide office in deep red Utah, well, the Democrats basically just stood down to allow independent, conservative but not crazy person Evan McMullin to run against extremist hard-right lunatic Mike Lee. Now, McMullin didn't win, but he did do like 20 points better than the last person who went up against Lee. Imagine if that sort of thing happened with the backing of an actual, at least semi-developed party infrastructure, with American politics increasingly driven by negative partisanship, that is to say, my vote is driven not by my love for my own side so much as by my fear of the other side. Well, there's an opening for this. Without wanting to come out on OK Talks with a full-throated endorsement of a minor party after I've just spent like half an hour bashing them in general, I think there's very much something to be said for, say, what the Forward Party is doing. From my understanding, that new party, founded by Andrew Yang and a couple of others, rather than running pointless spoiler candidates, is instead basically putting out a platform for serious reforms that would make America a better, more representative, better run, more multi-party friendly democracy, and then endorsing candidates from the two major parties with an actual chance of winning. This, to me, looks like a real way that additional parties could get involved. Pretty sure Forward, by the way, endorsed that McMullin effort that I described above, for example. And I would love to see them start getting in the game in the sorts of races that I was talking about before to challenge one-party dominance in places where the other party realistically has no shot. Look, bottom line, there are ways in which serious third-party movements could be built in the US, but it does not start at the presidential level. And those gambling with the very future of American democracy by deciding that right now, 2024, is the exact right time to start a third-party movement in the exact wrong way, well, some, I think, are genuinely unaware of the reality that supporting anyone other than Joe Biden will actively help Donald Trump to spend the next 4 years not in a prison cell where he belongs, but rather in the Oval Office. And in the cases of those people, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that they know that by November. But some definitely know what they're doing. And they should be considered in no way better than any overt Trump supporter. Jill Stein, Cornel West, RFK Jr., anyone actively backing their ridiculous campaigns, they can dress it up however they want. But realistically, they are spending the 2024 election cycle, which really could be our last, actively attempting to make sure that America's single worst citizen will again become its president. That's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure not to miss the next episode, be sure and subscribe to the podcast or follow the channel on YouTube. If you want to do me a favor, please do go ahead and hit like and leave a rating and a review, and most importantly, be sure to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks to those who already have, thanks to anybody who will, thanks as always to my friend Nate for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.